As I mentioned before, the return is required. The executor of the first spouse's estate must file an estate tax return on a timely basis and make an election to permit the surviving spouse to utilize the unused exemption. Now, it's possible through some regulations, some of these things may change, some of these statutes may be interpreted more liberally, but to me that means if a client comes to me several years after her husband dies and it turns out that she inherited everything and now she's over $5 million, and I say, well, did your husband file an estate tax return? And she said, no. I said, well, we can't, you don't have a dissouei. That exemption was wasted. All right. As I mentioned, you only get the last spouse's dissouei, and the remarriage can result in a loss or reduction of dissouei. It's important that you realize also it's not governed by the size of the deceased spouse's estate, meaning the surviving spouse gets the benefit of the entire unused exclusion of the predeceased spouse, regardless of the size of the predeceased spouse's estate. That means if the first spouse dies, he's got a modest estate, $100,000. No estate tax return is filed because everybody says, well, mom's got very modest wealth, she's never going to be over $5 million. And shortly after dad dies, mom hits the lottery. And now mom's estate is worth $10 million. And we're beyond the time to file the estate tax return with respect to dad's estate. She would not have the exclusion amount there, the dissouei there. But let's assume that even though it's a $100,000 estate, mom's attorney says, wife's attorney says, and the wife is the executor, you know what, I think you ought to file that estate tax return just in case and make the dissouei election. She says, well, I'll only get $100,000. That's the size of his estate. That's not the law. She gets the full $5 million estate tax exclusion amount, even though husband's estate was only $100,000. So what does that mean to all of us? That means we ought to be doing a lot more estate tax returns as a result of this. You had a question. What I think you're saying is, let's take my example again of husband dies, makes the dissouei, estate makes the dissouei election. Wife now has a $5 million of her own and a $5 million dissouei, and she's going to marry a guy who's phenomenally wealthy and he's used up his entire exemption. Can you negotiate in a prenuptial agreement